Welcome to LOP Topic Chats. My name is Kuhan Luke, and today we'll be discussing the changing magnetic field and what it means for humans and the planet alike. Over the past few years, 20 years or so, weird things have been happening that really cannot be explained other than that the magnetic field is changing and it's adapting or could be reversing. We've had animals dying off en masse, fish and other aquatic animals beaching themselves on the shore for no reason, birds dropping from the sky, dead, among other things. We've also had our polar vortex split this year, and further south than it usually is, which could be possibly caused by magnetic field or by other phenomenon. But we all know the magnetic field of the planet is here to protect us from cosmic rays and other stuff in space. And the weakening of it or reversal of it could have impounding effects upon human beings and animals alike. As we know from geological records, that the reversal of the magnetic field happens ever so often, whether it be 10,000 years, if not greater, or sooner. The questions that we'll have is, this reversal, does it take place over a matter of years, centuries, perhaps even overnight? And what kind of effect would that have upon our modern technologies as computers, as well as our brains, and the migration of animals? What would the effects be? And I'd like to ask the first question to my panel is, do you believe the magnetic field is reversing? And if so, what would the time frame be before it was complete?
This is Scarlette. Well, that is the question. What is the time frame? We can see it's changing. So what's the time frame for this thing? I'm really not sure.
The Ghost Scientist here. So what you have is, in the question that you're asking about time frame, you have to equate this to several different questions. Number one, do you believe that it's tied into theological theory? Do you believe it's tied into archaeological finds or geological theory? Or do you believe that this is an occurrence that happens on some sort of galactic or solar plane of existence, whether that be from vibrational space between particle mass structures and the Earth itself, and the effects that we see from the subatomic being equated to the atomic, being equated to the molecular, being equated to the physical mass of the planet itself, from outside particle mass structures. What kind of energies are we talking about? Such as, if you wanted to take a look at Paul LaViolette's study from 1972 with the G2 cloud theory. I think the question becomes, if you looked at it from archaeological figures or scientific archaeological finds, you see that there is a cyclical rate sometime around the 3,658-year mark, in that ballpark, give or take 400 years according to LaViolette. And there are other archaeological finds that say that you could give or take anywhere from 300 to 1,000 years, give or take. But I don't think there's a question that this particular event takes place, meaning the changing of the magnetic pole itself, from being the South Pole to the North Pole, or changing it or flipping it from its current azimuth location to the equator. We can see this in archaeological finds that we've gotten from South America and around those same regions, whether we're talking about the upper north, eastern, western regions of Australia, through Africa, you name it. There are definitely locations in archaeology itself that have shown that there are findings that show that these particular regions at one time were very cold. I think the question becomes, in the time frame, how do we equate a time frame to the subject? Because you don't have physical data that shows specifically when this event takes place. So you have conjecture, you have hypotheses. Now, as far as hypotheses now, you have current train thoughts of science saying that it could be anywhere from a 400-year term to a 4-year term to a 4-month term to a 4-hour term. And therein lies the question, because if you equate it to those particular time frames, over 400 years it would be a very small, minute movement of tectonic plate or the movement of the magnetic field across the tectonic plate, and then you could slowly see changes on Earth. That being changes on structure, its mass, its weight, etc., from magnetic flow underneath the surface, coming towards the surface, cooling and creating more crust, if you will, and the weight of that crust then changing the wobble or the formation of the planet Earth itself and its spin and its rotation within the solar mass of the galaxy. The problem with that being that you have to equate that to a specific particle mass structure. How can you equate that? Well, Laviolette equated it to barium-10. Others have equated it to the formation of C14 and the formation of its decay being that of roughly about its half-life at 5,000 years. Well, you don't have a constant in either of those because barium-10 doesn't exist on this planet. Therefore, you're going to try to use a solar constant that you cannot use in the equation. And then, as well as C14, it's up for debate exactly how long its half-life structure is. We've never studied it long enough in order to actually have a physical data that goes to a constant. So, again, all of this becomes conjecture and hypotheses. Okay, so let's use the hypotheses then, the speculation, if you will. You have this speculation of this magnetic field flipping within that 400 time period. Then you have 4 years. Okay, well, in a 4-year period, you'd be looking at pretty massive cataclysmic events, that being of massive tsunamis, tidal waves, earthquakes, the ring of fire itself becoming extremely active with lots of volcanic activity. You'd have a pretty huge shake on the Earth's surface. Well, you could say, yeah, we've seen some of that in the last 4 years, but does it equate to this particular magnetic shift? And it really doesn't in the interim of physics. It does not. So again, you're talking. So let's put into the equation this polar vortices that you're discussing and the splitting of the polar vortices. Okay, so you're equating the polar vortices because of its distance that it has traveled down towards the equator or closer towards the equator, but then again you have to take into account that the azimuth of true north has moved roughly over 300 plus miles, and that's up for debate because some are saying in the 360s, some are saying over 400. So again, you have to have a starting point, which we don't have in this discussion. If it was to happen within this 4-month period of time, even more apocalyptic type events would take place. You'd have mass destruction of major cities and infrastructure, as well as a complete breakdown of society and mass die-offs worldwide. Let's take it one step further than that and get to the 4-hour. So if you had this happen within a 4-hour event, it becomes the most interesting of the theories because if it was a 4-hour process from the time that it begins to the time that it actually ends, you'd end up having the planet Earth roughly getting to absolute zero within a 4-hour period of time, which means it wouldn't matter to any of us because nothing would exist on the planet's surface. We would fail to be here. So I think the change that comes with that is, what do you use as a basis? Where is the basis of this thing? Now, if you're asking for opinion, my opinion in this is that it probably equates more logically towards Laviolette's findings of G2, being that this process takes place somewhere around the 3,658 year mark, and it takes that long, and it's more due to solar positioning, the current solar position that we have around the sun, that also equates to galactic center. Wherever we happen to be in this giant soup bowl towards the galactic center, and the massive material or planetary structures, solar structures, and mass of physical material between us and the galactic center. Thereby, all of these particle masses flying through space, through solar space, all of those energies having an effect on outside properties of the sun itself, its reactions to CME, those CME energies being released out into solar particle mass, and solar particles themselves being accelerated towards the upper Van Allen belt region, those Van Allen belt regions then changing in their frequencies, thereby what we see now, creation of a third Van Allen belt region in between the higher and lower regions, and then those effects on the magnetosphere as a whole. And the question becomes, again with that hypotheses, do those energies really have an effect on the magnetosphere, or are those effects affecting the ionosphere and thereby the energetic properties of the electrons in the ionosphere becoming even more excited and thereby changing the magnetic field, or thereby changing the rotation of the core itself? And then the question then leads to, what is the core? Because there's no real definitive answer. As far as we're concerned, there's no real definitive answer as to how the core is even created, how it's constructed, or thereby its physical attributes or its physical outward attributes on the surface, on our surface plane. So, in my opinion, I think it's more likely that you have this 3,658-year cycle. It's the effects of this weakening of the magnetosphere that we see now is due to the fact that you have these solar particle structures that are bombarding us in our specific part of the galaxy and thereby affecting quark reactions of the magnetosphere itself. And the weakening process of this, or the weakening as we see this weakening, is really not a weakening. It's more of a movement, if you will, of the magnetosphere itself around the outside of the planet Earth and its effects on its surface. And because we're hominoids, we live on the surface, we see these effects, and we're trying to equate it to some answer, to some definitive answer as to why. So that's how I see it from a sheer scientific standpoint. And I give it back to you, Luke.
Okay, you say it's weakening the magnetic field. Could it be any danger for us humans at all? Like raising possibly, or perhaps changing our weather or climate a little bit?
I would see things, this is Nolo, I would see things as, if say for instance the equator is bulging, which it seems to be, and that's like a fat man putting on the same size shirt he wore yesterday, and the material of the shirt, of course, is going to expand outwards accordingly. And if you got more area to cover, then that expansion is going to necessarily mean perhaps that it's thinner. That affects, I'm not sure. We have correlations like you mentioned earlier about species die-off, or, say for instance the dolphins, and now what's happened to the viceroy butterflies, and or monarchs. If there's some sort of disruption in magnetic currents that disrupt the migration patterns, perhaps that sort of confusion would cause the species to miss their feeding patterns or their breeding areas or something like that. I can see that sort of correlation. To tie back to the polar vortex itself, yes, if you're going to move the magnetic field outward or change its parameters so it's not as a spherical an angle and more an oblong donut shape, then perhaps the focal point of where the solar wind impacts at the poles would have an impact on, say, creating low-pressure systems which would move things. What I find counterintuitive, though, correct me if I'm wrong, the magnetic north has been moving towards Siberia, which I would expect to be, that's the way the polar vortex would go, but it seems like instead the vortex is moving down on the North American continent, and I don't have an explanation for that.
Yeah, it's SEADOG here. I just want to inject a little bit of clarity or get some definition here. We seem to be talking about two radically different topics. One is a magnetic pole shift, the other is a geophysical pole shift. They're certainly not the same thing, and they are certainly not necessarily concurrent. So what is the actual topic here? Is it a magnetic pole shift or something distinctly physical in terms of orientation to the sun?
topic is the change in magnetic field and what it means for us. I have a question for the panel again, this conjuncture basically, but we have found woolly mammoths frozen in the ice with food still in their mouths. They have an instantaneous freeze. Could that have been caused by a quick reversal of the poles, do you think?
This is the ghost scientist again. Well, what you just described, Luke, is the reason why there was a theory formed about this 4-hour process, or about utilization of a 4-hour process. Because of that exact fact, thinking that because we've found fast frozen not only woolly mammoths but also hominoids in different locations around the world, that this effect could have taken place instantaneously. But how can you necessarily equate it to that and not some vortex or some weather change that took place where you would have like a super freezing or a sub-zero tornado hitting the ground and super freezing everything in its path? I mean, you could definitely have a finger of God level 5 type tornado hitting the ground, bringing super cooled air from the troposphere down to the planet's surface and then super freezing everything in its path. So you can't really point your finger to a specific. You see what I'm saying in this?
Yes, I do, and I presented a question to you earlier, too. The weakening of the magnetic field, if it weakens too much, would it be a danger to us?
Well, I think it would be an extreme danger to us. Not only would it be an extreme danger, but you asked a very interesting question, and the question you asked was, do you see this having an effect on humans themselves, like hominoids themselves, and what would these effects be? What I find interesting is you have the brainwave activity inside of humans that was at one point at 3.8 hertz that has now jumped up to 10 hertz in a very short period of time, and we quickly expect this hertz ratio to change within the say 12 to 13.3 range within the next few years. And the question becomes, why is this actually taking place? Where is the effects of this? Now, your question was, does the magnetosphere have some sort of effect on this? I believe that that's a good question, because if you equate the hertz ratio of the human brain in equation to solar hertz, they're almost identical in nature. You have just about the same exact hertz ratios. So can you correlate, because of course you're talking about a series of tuning forks that are all trying to resonate in harmonics. So here you have the magnetosphere resonating and changing its resonating field according to the resonating field of the sun changing its resonating field according to the resonating fields of the solar galactic center, and it's just a trickle-down effect, if you will. And I think, yes, you definitely would have these effects on an animalistic process to this, if you will, or on the zoological flora, fauna that we have on the planet's surface because of these resonating fields changes. I mean, we know for a fact that birds, according to what our known theory of science is, that we know that birds, the majority of which migrate according to magnetic field. We know that dolphins do, we know that whales do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we've seen these mass die-offs and confusions by these specific animals, including bees, by the way, who we also believe have some sort of utilization of a GPS system or an internal GPS based off of magnetics or based off of magnetic fields, that are all in this process of either confusion and then causing a die-off, or picking up bacterial infections from some location that they weren't expected to go to or had never been, that gives a die-off, or strictly just the resonating frequency that they currently are giving off in their brain, giving them instantaneous heart attacks, which is another theory. So I think what you get in this is you have so many theories and hypotheses that have no real definitive answer. I don't think there's an answer to the question. I think you can guess at the question and you can give speculation, but there's no definitive answer. There's no definitive, this is the finger on the trigger that points to the fact. which is a real problem in this, especially in this whole entire thing. But I think you definitely, if you look at sheer physics, if you look at the sheer physics of everything, you definitely can say that the equation of what the resonating field of the magnetosphere is definitely has a direct effect on the resonating fields of animals, mammals, reptiles, you name it, on the surface, including probably down into subatomic mass, or down into subatomic material, meaning the quark particles themselves and their reactions and spin and the vortices that they are in. I think you have to look at it from its total picture and not from a specific.
Yeah, Ghost, I want to go a little further with that with you. You're the molecular physicist here, and I have no doubt that the electromagnetic environment that life forms operate in is susceptible to changes to that environment in a very holistic way. But can we go one step further and say, would changes in the magnetic environment on Earth, are they capable of producing changes at the level of molecules? By that I mean, could molecules assemble themselves in different fashions? I'm thinking protein and DNA synthesis here, under a different electromagnetic regime.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're talking about isoleucine proteins, or you're talking about, lipids, or you're talking about getting down to amino peptide chains, I believe that they definitely can, because we know this from a genetic standpoint, that resonating fields, outside resonating fields put onto genetic material does cause mutative effects, or mutative genes to take effect, or specific unlocking of aminopeptide acids within inside of that genetic code. I mean, that's a given. We can see this in general mutations that we can do by taking a simple DNA strand, resonating certain frequencies across its field, and then seeing it germinate, or seeing it, if you will, go through the process of mitosis, and then watching the split of those genes and the mutations of the split of those genes in accordance to sound, or in accordance to hertz. And again, you have to equate this all back to hertz. Magnetic field, even though the magnetic field is what we consider to be a pole, which I think is a real simplified term. Pole is a real simplified term when you're talking about magnetics. I don't think that there's necessarily, and I take this from the standpoint of seeing it from the outside and from a scientific standpoint, there's no such thing as just a singular, like two poles being that of north and south. I think there's several multitudes of poles. We just happen to see the two poles being the North Pole and the South Pole, whether that be in a magnetics or whether that be on the planet Earth, being the most energetic. But there are variations in that field, and not only that, but taking those fields into a monopole field, which we know now exists. We know this to exist. So that even sends more of the equation into the field of how does this affect us at a cellular level? How does this affect us from a genetic standpoint, or from us as a species, a conscious, if you will, we being humans, thinking that we're the only conscious thinking life forms on this planet? How does that change the way in which we perceive our environment, or even for that matter, the physical manifestation of everything around us? Can this field change the resonating frequency of what we even can visually see? And I'll give you a pinpoint to this, a pinpoint standpoint where you could start from. The human eye sees 10 to the 20th power. If the human eye was capable of seeing 10 to the 40th, okay, at the 10 to the 40th power, you would start to visually see things that you would believe currently do not exist. But yet, if we resonate photons at those levels, and we start bombarding them into space, air, and then start electrifying those and taking pictures or images, if you will, whether that be radioactive or, radiological imaging, or whether that be micro radio waves themselves, or whether we want to get into the subatomic radio wave frequencies and taking images, we can take images of things that we can't personally see that exist. Okay? So if you have this change from people, from humanoids, from this particular magnetosphere itself, I think you're going to also see these changes in the animal kingdom or in a zoological process. You're going to see it, and I think we're already seeing it. And I think you're also seeing it on human beings now. You're starting to see this change in humans as far as the way in which they think, the way in which they comprehend. You're starting to see children born with much greater intelligences than what they should, according to us, actually have. And does all of this equate to this solar change in the magnetosphere that we have on the planet? That in lies the question, the real question.
This is Nolo again. Perhaps this is so. I'm thinking of, you said something here about being able, the change in the eyesight. If we go back in the archaeological record, there seems to be a great deal our ancestors made of ley lines, something we can't necessarily perceive now, but they took great pains to mark out with markers on where they were. I'm going to take a stretch here and say that equated with magnetic lines, of course, perhaps, you know, as the magnetic lines condensed, say, rope-like, like you see on the surface of the sun, and they actually mark these things out. What I would be curious is discovering whether or not those ley lines are actually still there or if they have moved, much like how you would take geological records, something with a lot of ferrite in it, and go to lava flows, and you can measure what the alignment was when the lava field was laid down, and then go back some centuries later and remeasure same geological alignment, but is the magnetic alignment the same or different, and perhaps get some sort of benchmark where you could measure when these things occurred and when major fluctuations had occurred, and basically what was the corresponding change in human society at that time.
SEADOG here again. That's an interesting perspective, Nolo. I'd like to see somebody do that too. We have to look at magnetism as essentially being an observation, though. It's a pretty difficult thing to describe it in terms of an operative physical force. But getting back once again to what Luke was asking and what Ghost had elaborated on, that is biological changes with a serious shift in the alignment of the Earth's magnetic field. If indeed molecules are capable of changing their isomeric alignment and orientation with a change in magnetism, then you could be looking at disruption of life at a molecular level.
There's possible physical effects or emotional effects. Maybe it causes us to be more irritable, more aggressive, maybe a higher crime rate, perhaps more wars, because the magnetic field is changing. What do you think about that idea?
We sit in an electromagnetic field all the time that we made ourselves. We've got power lines and cell phone towers and all kinds of stuff. And this has got to be affecting everything, too. This definitely can be affecting the human psyche. I have no doubt of that. But I don't know if it's connected in with the magnetic field at large or not.
Well, I like to use the term electromagnetic environment. It's not a polar thing, as Ghost was saying. It can have many, many different orientations and combinations. And I think there's little doubt that that environment will affect the electrochemistry of your brain and hence your emotional state, your general well-being, function of the immune system, all of that. I see a much more radical danger in that the actual structure of materials could be changed and lead to vastly radically different operating paradigms.
But then you bring up, you know, in this last statement you made electromagnetism. They're two separated fields. You're saying, I mean, electricity or electron flow in comparison to magnetism electromagnetism is the combination of the two. They're completely two different physical manifestations of energy.
Yeah, I was thinking more just of operating within the energy sea without defining exactly what's going on there. The energy sea we have must have physical, emotional, and sociological effects.
Well, and what then you have to bring up Aether, and do we really have enough time to describe or even educate in what Aether even is exactly, Luke? I mean, this goes back to a constant what I was discussing to begin with. There is no constant basis of knowledge in which to actually argue the point. All we can do is argue observation. Okay, so if you're going to argue observation, the effects of which could be vast. I mean, this thing could continue on for days, weeks, years, centuries in the argument, which, by the way, has already been taking place for thousands of years now, as to what the real true facts of these effects that we see are. I think you can pick tiny, minute points inside the theory that you can say, I point to this. This is the starting point, such as what Paul Laviolette did in 1972 by pointing to barium-10. Okay, but I don't believe that specific location or that specific particle mass structure of barium-10 is the basis for an entire hypothesis. So that's the question. What is the basis of this whole thing? I mean, yes, there's definitely geological changes on the Earth. There's definitely a change inside of the field of structure or the resonating field frequency of the magnetosphere itself. Then the question becomes, what the hell is the magnetosphere to begin with? Would we even like to get into this conversation? I mean, how do we even equate the distance, depth, or location of this magnetosphere outside of its context written in physics?
Well, let me ask you this for people who don't know any better. What would happen if the Earth did not have a magnetosphere in the first place?
Well, isn't that a good question? And the question becomes, is it work? How I would equate this, and this is, again, from as a scientist, this is the argument that you created, Luke. You believe it or not, is a very difficult argument. It sounds like something that's very simple when you have it inside of your head. Sorry about that, Lib. This is the Ghost Scientist again. Okay, so from a scientist standpoint, this is an argument that I've had with myself for years as to the properties of energy and thereby its interactions between other properties, other material, if you will. It's not as simple as having this is a simple question, this is a simple answer. It doesn't exist. It's so complex and so convoluted by man. Understand what I just said. This whole entire concept, theory, hypotheses of this whole entire conversation we're having is muddled by humanoids trying to put truth, if you will, or facts, if you will, to what we observe, and trying to equate that to something that we can utilize to point to as a fact, being that of mathematical equation or being that of a physical thing that you can look at or a physical thing that you can prove. I don't necessarily think that happens to be the case, because you go, if you used modern physics as a stable point of starting of this discussion, there are too many arguments that exist inside of physics itself, and even the modern concepts of physics itself, in order to point at a specific physical concept or theory, and this is what we're going to use. What I mean by this is, you can't use Einstein's constant. You can't use Newton theory. You cannot use, you follow where I'm going with this, you can continuously keep on going point for point for point for point as far as theory goes, but you cannot pinpoint a specific, and no one is going to agree with a specific.
This is Nolo. I guess the only thing I could say is life as we know it would be different. For one thing, we know that it's some sort of shielding of some sort. And protection from shielding, yeah, we may adapt and maybe radically different silicone creatures, but basically if it vanished overnight, the repercussions of it probably would be extinction level.
But let's equate it to a singularity style event then. I mean, if you wanted to take this to like the interactions of the magnetosphere in if we did not have one, what those specific what those specific properties or those specific instances would be on man or on the planet Earth as a whole. You have to ask the question, does the magnetosphere work like other magnetism in observation, meaning that is the magnetosphere itself a specific pole, and thereby other planetary bodies have their own magnetosphere that has a pole, and the interaction between these two specific poles justifies the distance between those solar bodies themselves and the reaction of spin within inside of the vortices of the solar plane of existence. Which opens up a whole new question. I mean, mind you what I'm saying here. There's no one answer, one hypothesis, or one theorem leads to more questions and not really more answers, which is really the conundrum that we're all in.
Yeah, it's SEADOG here. Yeah, I'm with you on most of that, Ghost. One of the things about the observational science, and science is based on repeatable observation, is that we're taking those observations within a reasonably stable paradigm. If we change that, for instance, magnetic paradigm, our observations, our physics, our science may change quite radically. And it's kind of futile at this point, as Ghost says, with so many questions unanswered or unanswerable, to make predictions of what would happen. But I agree with Nolo, if it was to happen overnight, I suspect it would be catastrophic in ways we cannot imagine.
Well, I think if you were to add in the equation that I just said, if you had no magnetosphere, you basically would have the planet Earth spinning freely off into space, off into the volume vacuum of space. And Lord only knows what the heck that would mean.
This is Nolo. I guess to return to the original objective here, is the polar vortex then, or the wobble we have in the weather, is that an indices of this sort of magnetic change on its way? Or we could, it's always an ongoing process. There's nothing that's static. But does this a signpost or a signifier that a major shift or parameter in our envelope magnetosphere is occurring?
SEADOG here. I would have to say that linking those two phenomena is a bit of a leap.
The ghost scientist here again. It's a leap it's quite a large leap actually. It's not even a small leap. It's a gigantic leap because again, let's throw in the mix equations as hertz, frequencies, just in simple sight, just in your observation, because we're making observation according to our visual capabilities as humans. What if we were to add in the equation, or were somehow capable of resonating our eyesight to a much higher rate, that being above the 10 to the 20th, what then would we see as magnetism itself, or even the magnetosphere? Would we understand it as a completely different particle mass structure? Would we see the interactions of those particular energies between resonating field structures itself, the electrons, neutrons, protons, phonons? I mean, there's too much to this equation to cut it into a simplified format. There really is. I mean, we can observe it, we can live it, but you cannot necessarily pinpoint these are the effects that will take place, because it's all conjecture.
This is Live Radio. Topic chat. Our chat's about the changing magnetic field and what it means for the planet Earth. My next question for the panel will be is, can the magnetic sphere or the magnetic field influence our weather in any way?
The ghost scientist. I would say the magnetosphere itself, in all essence, probably has no real effect on weather change or on weather itself. I think the weather itself would be more affected by the ionosphere and the troposphere and the density of those two particular fields. than what the magnetosphere actually has. I think the magnetosphere itself is more correlated to the polar center or the magnetic center of the Earth, if that in case is the fact. Of course, this is still going off of what our concepts of the construction of the Earth itself is. So if you want to use recent studies or recent scientific studies of how the Earth is constructed, then you would say that the magnetosphere is in direct conjunction with the field that's being generated by the center core of the Earth. That's the interaction that you would have, not necessarily the magnetosphere's reaction within geological weather patterns or changes, if you will.
This is Scarlette. There's something I want to say regarding the weather, and that is that when you look at the atmosphere, you have to look at it as a fluid, as an ocean, with layers and pockets and swirls, because this is how the atmosphere acts. We think of gas, but it's really more like the fluid. It's all fluid motion, and it's the same as the ocean, really, just different density.
Which is why I said which is why I said density. I think it depends on the density of the mass that you're talking about, because it is fluid in nature. We think of it as being gases, but it truly reacts in more of a fluid nature or a solid than a gas.
Yeah, SEADOG here. My understanding of atmospheric science, although quite limited, is that it's driven primarily by heat flux. And I agree with Ghost that I don't see a tremendous impact of changes in the magnetosphere with the process and distribution of heat flow.
I think the biggest effect you're going to see from weather changing is mostly from the troposphere itself, the density of the troposphere and the depth of the troposphere, depending on the location above wherever it is that you want to pinpoint the weather change.
Okay, it's Woo question time. Could these fluctuations in the magnetic field be caused by humans, possibly by HAARP or another device? What do you think?
Well, this is Nolo. Any time that you pump energy into a system, and basically that's what you're doing with ARP, is you're pumping energy. The energy has to go somewhere, and in just its physicality, it's not all that focused. So there's going to be splash of energy from that. Now, whether that affects things like the ionosphere, or that shifts the size of the opening above the poles, which allows an increase of the solar wind to penetrate, which does make effects on low pressure systems and such, which would affect storms. It's a very tenuous cause and effect, though, that I can see.
Yeah, SEADOG here. No, I'll give you that point, Nolo, that if the magnetosphere is acting as a shield to energetic events from outside the Earth, that admission of additional or decreased levels of that extraterrestrial energy could certainly have atmospheric effects.
What say you, Ghost?
Ghost Scientist here. I don't know if I really want to weigh in on that, simply from the standpoint that it would just lean into too many things.
Let me ask you this, a little more simpler question: Are we capable of influencing the magnetosphere at all?
I would think we could, because an atomic detonation probably does. But to what extent, I don't know. I've never looked into that. This is Scarlette, by the way.
SEADOG here. Okay, somebody's got to talk. I've got nothing to say, but I'll talk. Reminds me of somebody else on here on occasion. But I really don't think we're capable of seriously changing the magnetosphere. I think the energies involved and the whole concept of magnetism is kind of beyond us at this point. We don't understand what's going on here in the first place, affecting it, except accidentally through a nuclear detonation. I can't see that link myself. But no, my opinion is that HAARP and so on and so forth is not in any way responsible for this. In any event, it's been demonstrated it's happened in the past, long before we had things such as HAARP. So I would consider this a completely natural event, probably extraterrestrial in nature.
This is Nolo again. Yes, I would expect something on the level of being able to change the rotation of the core of the Earth to see any sort of measurable effect on the magnetosphere. I can't even see our insignificant electromagnetic efforts having much other than temporary ripples in a magnetosphere. I can't even, I don't know the Gauss value, but what's the largest magnetic field that we can create here on Earth is totally insignificant to that surrounds the Earth. So I don't think that ARP could do such a thing. For one thing, it's in frequency ranges, and I don't think that you can equate magnetism with energy frequencies at all. I think we're talking apples and oranges here.
There's been a lot of talk over the years about a major pole shift of the planet, and we saw that in 2012. Everyone's got excited and scared, saying the poles are going to shift in 2012, and it never happened. But there are some prophecies, though, that kind of show that something like that might happen in the future. There's a verse in Revelations, I do believe, that an earthquake will touch every major city, which is kind of like a sign of a major pole shift that happens within a matter of hours or days, basically. Let's pray that never happens, though, but I have to retouch that subject again. Do you guys feel that the pole shift, the reversal, if it does happen, could it happen overnight, within days, or do you think it's a long process?
This is Nolo here. If you're talking a geological shift, we're not talking magnetic poles here, which, as Ghost Scientist mentioned earlier, there are actually spots where you could say this spot is north and this spot is south. I'm just assigning arbitrary names to these, but they appear all over the Earth in some degree or another. We're used to thinking of in terms of a magnetic north at the North Pole and a magnetic south at the South Pole, but there's actually eruptions, if you want to call it, of magnetic strength of either north or south, just to assign values to them, all over the planet, and they've shift around quite often. So, but if you're talking in terms of geological shift of the poles, I'm afraid that would require such a massive influx of energy. One, I doubt the planet could survive. It would just tear it apart. The crust would not survive it. It would rearrange. But to do so would cause a planetary close passage. I don't know if you're familiar with the electrical theory of the universe, but just the close passage of another planet and its electrical field interacting with ours could flip it. Or, on the other hand, if you didn't believe that, it's still the gravitational forces, the just matching spins, so to speak, would cause not just a polar shift, but it would cause a change in orbit altogether. And once again, we're talking extinction level. I don't see any sort of mechanism whatsoever that would enable a geological flipping of the poles, so to speak. That would require such a manipulation of mass and inertia, and the centrifugal force resistance and all of that it would only something of a greater, an equal or greater mass could affect such a thing. Now, of course, you can equate with, you can substitute energy for mass and increase 10 times the energy and reduce the mass by a tenth, but still, there's nothing that we know of with that sort of energy source that it could affect a geological process like that. In any case, that's a total moot point, because just a shifting of a geological pole would be such a rearrangement of the entire planet that there would be no discussion of anything surviving on it. It would be game over, reshuffle the deck, and it'd be like stumbling upon a newly formed planet.
But with the magnetic poles moving like they are to Siberia, would it not affect the crustal movement too a little bit, possibly? Or is that two different things?
Two different things. This is Nolo again. Two different things, unless you're talking we have a completely iron crust, which we don't. As far as we know, we do measure magnetic changes like that. Like I said, in the more ferrous deposits, the iron-rich deposits in volcanoes, they can see over time where the magnetic particles are aligned in one direction, geologically speaking, north, and a subsequent flow, maybe hundreds of thousands of years later, and the alignment of those particles still geologically in the same, how it flowed down the volcano, still, say, a north-south direction. The magnetic alignment, though, however, might even be as much as 45 to 90 degrees off from that. But there has been no correlation between any kind of crustal movements that we know of and these corresponding, for 90 degrees to me is radical changes in magnetic alignment. In other words, there's been no correlation between massive Earth movements and these magnetic changes. There doesn't seem to be any correlation at all.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Mr. Clean. Once again, you're listening to LOP Radio. I'm your host, Kuhan Luke, and please go ahead with your question, Mr. Clean.
Hi, thank you very much, Luke. This is Mr. Clean, and I hear us really talking about two separate ideas here. One is the changing of the magnetic poles, which is not a physical changing of the planet, but just its magnetic poles. The other is a true shift of the planet, where the South Pole would move on up to the North Pole, so on and so forth. A magnetic shift would cause havoc with our electronics, but probably not destroy mankind and his technology. Now, if something were to cause the planet to flip from tail to head, that, of course, would be a world ender of mankind and probably all the creatures on the Earth. And yes, there are a few things that could cause that to happen, and yes, it would take massive force. A huge planet the size of Jupiter or larger rolling through the neighborhood could have that kind of effect. A star, particularly a very large star, rolling through the neighborhood could have that effect, as well as a black hole with its phenomenal gravity could affect the planet in that way.
Let me ask this, Mr. Clean. There's a lot of science going on lately with mass animal die-offs, animals being beached on the shores, the polar vortex being split, and anomalies everywhere. Do you feel that the magnetic field is actually changing, if not preparing to reverse, or do you think this is part of a normal cycle?
The problem is we haven't been observing things in the grand scheme of the planet, well over 4 billion years old, for very long, maybe a couple thousand years, and for all we know. And if you go ahead and check on the North Pole, where they have instruments that set at the exact North Pole, there's actually a line of them, because it does change between feet and yards every year, and they have to add a new device that's at the true new magnetic north.
Oh, SEADOG here. The drift of the magnetic pole is very, very well documented. It's published in charts, and it has been changing. It has been accelerating. Some interesting effects I saw that when we were talking about geomagnetic anomalies, the South Atlantic magnetic anomaly is quite vast. And the year I was in the Antarctic, it drifted a little further south, and we did start to see things like whales beaching themselves, penguin die-offs, the disappearance of the krill population, if you can imagine that, overnight. So there's no doubt in my mind that geomagnetic fluctuations do have biological effects.
Yeah, this is Nolo again. Yes, anything that would rely on magnetic lines for navigation is going to be an effect, because if they're used to using a certain pattern to arrive at mating areas or their feeding grounds or a combination of the two, any change in those magnetic lines, and they follow them by habit or, by instinct, is going to put them in an area that is not as they originally learned that behavior or whatever, was imprinted. And yeah, you could arrive at areas that's inhospitable for breeding or that doesn't have any nutrient fields like they were used to. I can see this playing absolute havoc upon them. And that reflects back on perhaps humans being able to perceive these and mark them out for whatever purposes back in prehistory of the ley lines, which, as near as I can tell, that research on that is kind of fuzzy, but they also corresponded to some sort of magnetic lines. They call lines of force, and what that meant for us might have been markers, as just like the stones in Japan marked the high water mark for tsunamis. This also may have been, if you perceive that the magnetic lines are deviating from the stones that we placed marking the last where the ley lines were as they knew it, then that may indicate something, probably disastrous. I don't know, but at least, their hunting patterns, when they planted their crops, all of that sort of thing. Yes, that may have had an impact.
And we have a question from the chat room from Soothsayer. Well, since the sun seems to flip its poles and the moon appears to have done the same, wouldn't the rush the Earth is doing the exact same thing, like a connected cycle? Kind of like, the sun has swapped its poles. Would that be influencing the planet Earth too a little bit? What do you think, panel?
The sun flips its poles every 11 years. The sun does this on a regular basis. I don't know about the moon, but what I would say is, even if it does, we don't know the sequence of the cycle. It might not all be bang, bang, bang. It's definitely not simultaneous. So we don't have enough data to speak on that, I'd say.
This is Nolo. Once again, we're talking about a magnetic pole swapping, so to speak, and an actual, heliocentric flipping of the poles, which is, it's hard to imagine an object the size of the sun rotating in such a way that it, counter to its rotation, I don't know if it's going clockwise or counterclockwise, I'm assuming clockwise, that it would actually change its position in the solar system so that it basically stood on its head. The same with the moon. I don't think that we see the craters arranged upside down from what we normally perceive them, and everybody has to flip their atlases and their coffee table books of the moon upside down to correspond with what they see, in the sky. I think once again we're confusing what's a planetary flip of an arbitrary north and south, where the pole is facing one way towards the plane of the ecliptic, and then points in the opposite 180 degrees from that point. I don't think we're actually seeing that. In other words, if you put a thumbtack at the top of the sun, I don't think we'd wake up the next morning and find that thumbtack pointing below the sun, so to speak. The same with the moon. We're talking, when you're talking something rotating, it's like if you ever had a gyroscope and you set the thing spinning. Have you ever in your hands, have you ever tried to flip that gyroscope over? And you can feel the resistance in your hands when you try and even tilt and turn the gyroscope to turn it exactly 180 degrees, in other words, swap ends. You can feel the resistance in your hands of trying to do that. Now imagine that on a stellar or planetary scale, and you're talking an obscene amount of energy and force, and I don't see that at all. I see more, yes, magnetic conceivable, yes, obvious. Then Nolo again. The question from Queen was if it was the magnetic poles that are flipping, what's the result? I don't think it's anything much that I don't think it's largely anything that we can perceive, so to speak. The secondary effects concerning weather or migratory patterns or electronics or things like compasses and such, yes, obvious. You can measure effect. That's how we know about it whatsoever. But as far as its effect on geologic processes, which is what we would be concerned about, I don't think so, unless it was part of a larger cascading effect that not just involved magnetics, but involved something else.
SEADOG here, yeah, it's been brought up a couple of times that there would be electronic or effects on electronics by a shift in the magnetic field. And I'm wondering where that comes from. As far as I know, magnetism does not affect electron flux. Ghost, if you're on, chime in on this one.
Okay, with that, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and we'll get back to that subject in 10 minutes. Welcome back to LOP Radio. This is our topic chat. My name is Kuhan Luke, and we're talking about the changing magnetic field. And I'd like to redirect a question that goes now that this mic is working. Do you believe humans have the ability to influence the magnetic field, say like through HARP or another device?
The short answer to that is no. I do not believe that we possess the technology capable of changing magnetic fields. That's the short answer. There's a much larger answer to that deals directly with HARP, but that's a whole other program.
Thank you for that. And I do believe Mr. Clean has another question for the panel.
Yes, the question that I had dealing with magnetics has to do with the famous double-slit experiment where we find that photons act as both a wave and a particle, something that has mass. Now, we've noticed that when people watch, you get one result. When people are kept away, we have another. Does that mean the electrical fields involved with people are affecting the electrical field and that area of the planet changing the results?
Absolutely, because you're talking about resonating fields of frequency. Your brain resonates a frequency. When you're in observation, you're emitting a frequency because, simply put, humanoids are transmitter receivers. So if you're observing it, your observation is creating a frequency that is then being outputted into the aether, if you will, that then changes the resonating frequency of that specific particle. So the easy answer to that is yes, it does change according to observation.
Well, then the question would be, this is Nolo, what's the ratio between human potential and the the magnetic field surrounding the Earth? In other words, now I think what the underlying question would be, do humans have the ability with that observation to affect such a structure as the magnetic field?
I would disagree because the magnetic field does not have particle mass. You're talking about apples and oranges. On one hand, you have a particle mass structure. On the opposing side, you have an energetic property, or just simply an observation of a field of structure. There's no physical matter in which to interact with.
Hi, this is Mr. Clean. I'd like to expand my question with one more part. If that observing human was in a Faraday cage, so that they are electrically isolated, however, still observing. Would that still have an effect on the dual slit experiment?
SEADOG here. That has been tested, and yes, indeed, they do still have an effect.
But the observation that you're discussing is, let's talk about phase shifting of photons between a photon and a phonon. I mean, if you really want to take the slit experiment to its full context, you have to discuss what is the definition of a photon.
Mr. Clean here, that is part of the problem because the best we can figure out, it acts as both a particle, something with mass, and yet can also act as a wave, a non-particle without mass.
And therein lies the question. Are we talking about positive matter energy space, or are we talking about negative matter energy space? And
in my opinion,
the point of this, the way that the photon is described in its description of its function as a particle and as a wave structure, the photon can be compared to the apex, if you will, or the crossing point of resonating field structures or resonating wave and particle structure. And thereby you have a duality between resonating field and particle mass that then creates this structure that we can observe. It's a separated field. It's apples and oranges. They're two separate entities existing in one particle structure, if you will. So it's not a singular. A photon is not that of simply light or particle mass structure. In comparison, it is not just a sound or wave or resonating frequency.
SEADOG here. And one might also argue, guest, that the act of observation, somehow or another, collapses the waveform and thereby creates the matter effect. That there may actually be no matter. I know we've touched on this in the past.
And that would take us way off this beaten path, because that goes into a whole different series of physics.
Yes, agreed. We're dealing with a little continental drift here, so to speak.
I have another question for the panel as well as the room. Let's say there's a huge magnetic fluctuation for one reason or another. Would that affect any kind of effect on the grid of the electrical grid of the planet, or planes or other devices, do you think?
Define your question a little simpler there, Luke.
Let's say there's a huge fluctuation in the magnetic field due to something in space, basically, where the field got weaker suddenly or stronger. Would it have any effect upon electronics on the planet?
Absolutely not. It would have no effect on technology whatsoever. If it was a change or an influx or density in the ionosphere, then yes, definitely you would have an effect on technology. But the magnetosphere in no way, shape, or form would have an effect on technology.
SEADOG here. Ghost, is it possible that a realignment of magnetic fields could affect material structure and properties, and thereby have a technological effect?
Wow. Okay. You'd have to put it in context of the specific material structure that you're talking about, or particle mass structure that you're talking about, but it would be dependent. If you're talking about formation of crystal structures or formation of crystallization, yes, you would definitely have a change or a transmutation of material structure or transmutation of molecular structure, but it would again depend on the material in which you're describing and its effects, and not only that, but its density of its own molecular structure, meaning like what is its basis of carbon, iron, so on and so forth, etc. I mean, there's too many variables to answer the question definitively.
But it is possible. I'm thinking specifically of metals here.
Well, that's why I brought up crystallization, because if you look at the crystal formization, the crystal formization of metals in general, whether that's AU, PT, PL, PD, go on down through the elemental forms, you definitely would see a change because of the way in which the crystal itself would grow in accordance to the magnetic field that it is occupied, or that occupies its structural growth.
But would that reorientation that would change the molecular properties of a metal, a crystalline metal, would that require it to be in a fluid stage at the time of transition, or not? I think it would have to be.
I think it would have to go through those states. I mean, you definitely could see where the crystal formation itself became fluidic in nature, or became a liquid, or went to a liquidized state, and then back into, once it's resonated, once it's found its harmonic level within inside of that magnetic field, then yes, you would have a reformation back into a solid. The question would be, what would that solid entail? What would be the structure? What would be that construct of molecular build, if you will, after the fact, after it got to its harmonic level?
Yeah, what comes to mind here is semi-solids, in particular glass. It's quite possible that the cohesive properties of glass could come right apart in a fixed pane of glass with a certain geomagnetic orientation. Or am I just talking crap here?
No, I see. You could definitely see that, say, within a diachoric structure, or in a crystal diachoric structure of glass. That definitely, I mean, it would depend on the amount of carbon that made up that specific structure.
I have a question from PM, somebody in the room, asking if the magnetic field has any influence on Groundhog Day. What?
Did you say flora and fauna?
Sure.
I'm sorry, would you repeat the question? I didn't catch it.
I have a question from somebody in the room. I'm not going to say any names, but they asked if the magnetic field of the planet has any influence upon Groundhog Day.
I tend to doubt it.
I think that current scientific studies have demonstrated quite conclusively that the groundhog would levitate.
Hey, he's a fat little bugger. I wouldn't count on it.
And we have a real question from the room, from Mr. Clean. Do we have any proof of magnetic fields of the Earth affect humans?
I think you would. It depends on what you mean by effect. I mean, you'd have to give it a definition of what effects on humans you would discuss. I mean, at the atomic level or at the genetic level, I would say yes, you definitely would see a change, a mutative or transmutative change from a genetic standpoint, simply because of the formation, or if you want to put it in terms of crystallization, like fractal building of the actual genetic code itself. I could see that definitely being something that could be affected through the process of the hominoid or humanoid on the planet. I could also see your brainwave activity being that in the Hertz ratios being changed or being manipulated through magnetic field structures, and we know this to be true not only from scientific standpoint, but we also use it in advanced weaponry. So to effects on hominoids. So I would say yes, there definitely is an effect on the hominoid. The question becomes, what is the specifics of those effects, and what is the definition of the effect that you're asking about?
I'm sorry, I was unclear. I was referring to physiological and psychological effects of magnetic fields and changes of magnetic fields. Since we're talking about changing magnetic fields of the planet, will that change people or certain people's the way they think, act, react, feel?
I would say absolutely, because the magnetic field has a reaction between the wave structure it creates and a change on resonating fields. And since your consciousness works on Hertz, it definitely would have a change.
SEADOG here. Certainly there must exist extensive literature on this topic if somebody did a search for it. For human beings working in very, very high-level magnetic fields, artificially generated magnetic fields, that documentation must be out there. I'd suggest you just look for it.
There is actually, SEADOG. Now that when you discuss it, there actually is, because when you're working in fields, say T8 and above, being Tesla 8 and above, which is the scale that you use for magnetism is in the T scale, the Tesla scale. Once you start getting up into the T11, T15, between T11 and T15, you actually you cannot be in contact with those types of magnetic fields for any real length of time, because it distorts the resonating field or the resonating structure of your heart. It actually can cause real ailment, real problems on the humanoid itself.
You were talking about extremely powerful magnetic fields that were created artificially. My question was, fields that are created naturally by the planet, are they strong enough to affect our mentality, so on and so forth?
Sure they are, because like I was saying, I don't know if you were here earlier, Clean, when I said that at one point the magnetosphere was basically resonating at about 3.5 hertz. Our brainwave activity at one point was between 3.5 and 3.8, and as that magnetosphere changes, we notice that human brainwave activity changes to correlate to it, to resonate or become harmonic towards it. So now we have brainwave activity in the 10 hertz ratio, and we expect this to rise about upwards of 13.2 to 13.5 hertz, within the next 5 to 10 years. So, and we see this change through resonating frequencies of the Earth itself and how the resonating frequency of the Earth itself goes, because you understand you're talking about vibrational space, and vibrational spaces correlating to each other, trying to come to a harmonic, or becoming a harmonic, if you will. So yes, it does change it even on a minute level, even though I was saying using a T11, T15 scale as an example, it just shows that yes, that definitely there is a physical manifestation from the wave structure itself to the human brain wave activity. Thereby, yes, even in a minute standpoint, you would still have interactions because you're around it. It's around you. You're in a magnetic field. So this field definitely has an effect on your particle mass structure itself at the genetic and at the brain wave level.
Yes, there changes the frequency, so on, but how is that seen or felt by the person? Will they have headaches? Will they be smarter, dumber? Will they get sick easier? Will they have a greater resistance to illness? What kind of physiological and psychological effects on fields that are generated by the planet would we see in humans?
I don't necessarily think that there's enough data to give a definitive answer to that question. I think you can point to, if you look at, I'm just bringing this up. I know Luke was talking about bringing up Hoo-Hooville, and some of the Hoo-Hooville that I look at when you're talking in discussions to this is these new star children that are being claimed as star children around the world. You're starting to see new growth in brainwave activity, and especially a very much younger generation that has unlocked, and whether that's through resonating field structures of the Earth, the planet Earth itself, or resonating structures from outside the Earth, being that of a solar resonating field, changing the genetic sequence or changing the genetic code in such a way that these particular individuals or these particular young individuals are being able to tap into a much greater ability from their own brain itself, like being able to tap into portions of the brain that normally you would not have access to, or having connections, neurologically speaking, along the neural pathways itself between the synapses inside the brain, being able to fire across and have electrons travel on those specific neural pathways that the average human being doesn't. And we see this exponentially. Especially over the last say 10 to 15 years, we've noticed a huge increase of just random intelligence coming from a very young humanoids here on this planet. I mean, greatly so.
Thank you for that. After you probably close our show, I have one more woo question for the panel. Could we use the magnetic field of the planet to possibly time travel or dimensional travel? We have we tried in the past, aka the Philadelphia experiment or a Montauk?
Do you really want to get into that? Seriously?
But is it possible to do that through the magnetic field, though?
How much time would you like this thing to go? You want to discuss about time travel in accordance to magnetic field structures, and that of which were used at say either the Philadelphia experiment, actually Project Rainbow, Project Fairfield, in accordance to Project Calypso at Montauk and Montauk 2. I mean, that's a whole show in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, this is Nolo. Are you talking dimensional travel, and the time travel is just basically a side effect, so to speak? Does that have to do with magnetics? I don't think so.
Well, I think the magnetic field itself is a part of the equation, because you have to define reality, which is a long process, because what do you utilize to define reality as we perceive it? I mean, if you're looking at, do we want to look at magnetic fields interaction on physical matter space, or do we want to look at magnetic fields reaction on negative matter space? Because they're dualities, they are of the same. You have this hourglass structure, if you will, that is split into two, and you have physical matter on one side of the equation and negative matter on the opposing side of the equation. And is this point at which the two meet this magnetic field that we're talking about, or is that the creation of the wave structure in which, or the observational wave structure that we see by those particular planes of energy? I mean, that's a whole argument and debate in and of itself. And I also think you need to define the conversation of time travel itself. Like, what do you declare as time travel? I mean, there was no such thing as time till man invented it. So get rid of the connotations of what time actually is and put it in its context. Travel, possibly. Time, I don't think has anything to do with the equation.
It's like traveling back to like World War II or back to the Dark Ages. That kind of time travel.
No, I mean, you're talking about, first off, most people don't even understand the concepts of time travel to begin with. They don't understand the positions. If you went back and, I'll put it this way, if you went back in time right now, like say you were capable of opening a portal in which you could walk through the portal and go back to 1931, Germany, okay? If you walked through the portal, by the time you got to 1931, the planet Earth would no longer be in the location in which you walked out at. Meaning that if you had to pick a pinpointed time and space, a pinpointed physical time and matter and space, if you walked through this portal to go back to 1931, after you got to the other side of the portal, there would be no physical Earth in the location in which you were trying to walk onto, because of the way in which the Earth actually spins through the universe.
Then you must have to time and space travel at the same time then, correct?
So what you're talking about is a dimensional travel, not per se time travel. If you skip across the dimensions, all you're doing is changing points of reference in reference to the dimension that you're entering and leaving.
Well, there's no, like, again, you cannot equate time and space and travel all in the same terminology, because they're completely separated fields of study. They're completely separated things when you're talking about, in reality, to the actual process, meaning the reality of actually accomplishing this specific task. Because it would be more location, specifics in location of where the end point would be than it would be in time. Time really has nothing to do with it. Time is just a perception. So get rid of the time. Throw that out the window. Let's talk about strictly going from one location to the next location, or from one vibrational space to the next vibrational space. There are variables to that would have to be that you'd have to know the exact resonating field in which you are entering, number one, because let's say, for example, by the time they figure out the process, and I'm not saying they haven't, I'm saying let's go hypothetically speaking, if you, at some point in the future they figured out a way to create this portal in which we're discussing, and you were to walk through this specific portal, you're going to be resonating at a completely different frequency than where you're walking onto or where you're walking out into in that time dimensional space, or in that particular physical matter space, if you will. So you're going to be phase shift completely away from physical matter, because you're not going to be resonating and you're not going to be able to interact with that specific physical matter, because you will be resonating at a completely different frequency than that physical matter itself. So again, it goes back to, does magnetism have something to do with the process? Does this magnetosphere that surrounds the Earth deal or have something to do with this process and its ability, or your lack of ability, in order to accomplish the task of traveling through space and dimensional space to some specific point in what we consider as being time? That there's a whole series of equations you would have to put in with that. You couldn't just say, yes, definitively that's how it works, because in reality it doesn't. If you put reality into the mix, it doesn't work like
that. I think they're thinking, and this is Nolo again, I think they're thinking in block diagram terms rather than in specific schematics. It's analogous to taking the story of Flatland, where the sphere interacted with the flat dimensional plane. Conceivably, you could change where that sphere intersected, where the three-dimensional object intersected with the two-dimensional object, and if you had a way of choosing where that intersection point would be, then that's analogous to some sort of time travel per se.
Well, I think that Mysteries brought up a really key point in this discussion, and his what he wrote in chat was possibly the magnetosphere acts as a veil. Okay, possibly it works as a veil. Well, the question becomes the construct in which we exist in, this magnetosphere, the ionosphere, with all of these different energies in layers. Okay, in layers. Is it creating a shield effect? Excuse me. Is it creating a shield effect in which stops man, or humanoid, or hominoid, if you will, from manipulating or traversing universal space? And I've actually had this argument with some pretty learned physicists on this exact subject. Does this equation of the resonating field structures that are around us, the magnetosphere, the ionosphere, the Van Allen belts, all of these different particle wave structures and particle mass itself, cause this wall, a firewall, if you will, that we're not allowed to pass through, and that's the reason why it exists to begin with? I think that's a real question, and I think it brings up a very key point to this discussion.
We've certainly jumped off the cliff here, but yeah, I would tend to agree. There is the potential that the magnetosphere is indeed the imprisoning veil that is spoken of in antiquity.
Hi, this is Mr. Clean again. Are you saying that if we were to take some of these magnetic experiments out of the Earth's atmosphere far enough away so the magnetosphere of the Earth is not affecting them somewhere in space away from planets and what have you, then these experiments would have different results than those that are done on the Earth with the Earth's geomagnetic field?
SEADOG here. That is absolutely, completely, and totally possible. And in fact, some of the Earth changes we may be seeing now may be due to a weakening of that veil and extraterrestrial energies of undescribed forms reaching the Earth. That's my pet theory.
Well, this is Nolo, realize that heavy-duty experiments where particles can go astray, generally they're performed underneath some sort of magnetic bottle or a magnetic envelope or container of some sort. So if you extrapolate from that as the Earth being inside of a magnetic bottle or container, then I can draw that analogy.
I may be misunderstanding it, but I was under the impression they were saying the geomagnetic field of the Earth is the veil containing feature.
Agreed, and I think it could be possibly that you have an interaction between the ionosphere and the magnetosphere and the upper and lower and now middle Van Allen radiation belt as a prison, if you will. I mean, that's the easiest way to explain it. I mean, in the simplest layperson's terminology, like these particular fields of structure that are around the Earth have created this imprisoning formation so that conscious humanoids who create technologies or take and manipulate other genetic materials, other technologies, stopping that process, stopping them from, changing or manipulating its environment that it currently exists in. I mean, you can take that from, again, like I was telling Luke earlier, this conversation is not a simple conversation because it leads to too many other conversations, such as the observation of man's ability to go from the planet Earth to the lunar surface of the moon. And understanding that if you really looked at the true science behind the actual physical data, it would be impossible for any organic mass structure comprised of carbon to traverse even the smallest amount of space between us and the lunar surface.
All I can say, and I've said this before, is that if the whole space program was just a gigantic hoax, they spent a lot of money. Because I stood next to the reporter's sign, and I felt the blast from the backwash, and I watched that thing go up at night. It was one incredible launch. That's an awfully big expenditure of looky here, and that's just one little part of it, in order to do something. Or claim we did something that we didn't actually do. I just can't buy that we would spend that much money on a fraud. I just can't.
The question is not the question of whether or not we were capable of designing, engineering, and building rocketry capable of leaving the Earth's surface. That's not the question. That isn't even. I don't think that's even up for debate. We know that to be a constant and a fact. The question becomes, can you traverse from starting at about 500 miles above the Earth's surface? From that point, could you traverse through the next three fields of particle energies being constructive of a organic mass and withstand the solar particles, that the simple interactions between the solar particles and your subatomic and atomic structure that make you up in order to get to the lunar surface? That's the question. And if you really want to look at the real data, the true statistics, the true data of that, it's impossible.
I want to thank everyone for such a great program. We're going to wrap it up now. This is LOP Radio. We've been talking about the changing magnetic field. We have learned that it has changed in the past, it's changing now, and it always will change. And please keep one thing in mind: everything does change in life. Thanks for listening. Have a good one.